Today we have Apple, Samsung and Microsoft. Smartphones and laptops are about enough tools anybody needs these days. But some 70 years ago, people actually relied on mechanical wrist wonders. When you think about tool watches, the first brand that comes to mind is obviously Rolex. I'm happy to welcome you to the watch guide of Rolex's first tool watches. Whether you're a pilot, a diver, or a race car driver, you ought to have a watch from this brand. At least that was what the ads were telling you. And I'm here to tell you that Rolex aiming at these specific professional fields was no coincidence. They all exude and enjoyed prestige. And that is what Rolex likes. They want to link their brand to successful people, as if you were only to buy a Rolex if you had made it in life. Also emphasized by their very nice slogan, a crown for every achievement. I mean, if it's good enough for an explorer that withstood the most challenging circumstances, it's definitely good enough for you, right? Well, Rolex in harsh conditions turned out to be a perfect match. They optimized their usability and reliability over the years with their sturdy bracelets, automatic movements, and water and dust-proof oyster case as most important contributions. The demand from various professional fields rose to an all-time high in the 50s. Now was the time for Rolex to show what they can do and use it for their marketing at the same time. As they did with the introduction of the oyster case when Mercedes Gleitze swam across the English Channel wearing a Rolex in 1927. Now this is something you probably already knew, but the real game changer was introduced in 1953 under reference 6202. Better known as the Turnograph, and as the name implies, it has a rotatable bezel. Whilst it wasn't the first time they made the Zerograph in the 30s and Blancpain just released its diving watch, the 50 Fathoms, it can be seen as the alpha model, an historical artifact and most certainly the blueprint for the most famous watch ever. We are getting ahead of ourselves. That watch and all others will be individually examined in this video, but let's stick to the Turnograph for a second. Perhaps a bit of a stranger in our midst, as it was later grouped under the Datejust line. However, it does deserve an honorable mention, and with its 37mm measuring case, it's perfect for my wrist and therefore the watch I'm wearing for this video. I have the pleasure to walk you through the different lines from the 20th century, and I will do so in chronological order. The focus is on the very first models and examine its true origins. Hopefully we can learn something regarding its history, design and mechanics. The first one is the Explorer. Rolex registered the Explorer trademark in January 1953, but it wasn't until way later that year for the first references bearing this name on the dial first saw light. In the meantime, in May to be precise, Sir Edmund Hillary submitted the Mount Everest wearing an Oyster Perpetual, and you guessed it, it was sponsored by Rolex. So Rolex now reached the highest point of the earth. This is time for Rolex to capitalize on this accomplishment and launch the 6150 and 6350. Most notable and iconic is the dial layout with the 369 in Arabic numerals. To this day this is referred to as an Explorer dial. This even if it's featured on other models like a Submariner. However, the Explorer wasn't necessarily the first model to flaunt these numbers at the quarters, yet they stick with it throughout their entire production, making it the most iconic feature of this long-lasting model. The dial surface itself could either be smooth or have a honeycomb pattern instead, and different handsets were used over the course of a couple of years. The case measures 36mm and the bezel was domed. The 6350 is chronometer certified, whilst the 6150 bears the name Precision on the dial rather than a COSC certification above the 6 o'clock position. So 6350, 6150, but arguably the 6090 can be considered the real father. Different on this one compared to basically all other Rolex watches is that the bezel isn't mounted to the case but is actually part of the case. Whatsoever, the Explorer caused a peak in their reputation. Moving on from the Explorer that saw great heights to the bottom of the ocean. Let's dive deep into the story of the Submariner. I have already mentioned the most famous watch ever, and whilst this statement might be up for discussion, there is very little doubt about the long-standing influence of the Submariner. And I would say it has the most iconic design, so it's therefore also the most often copied watch in history. Yet the rich history of these immortalized models started quite modest. There has been some conversation about the first references and also about the date of introduction, but with confidence I can introduce you to the 6204 that was commercially available in 1954. Rolex had to confront a number of challenges when designing its first dive watch. The watch obviously had to withstand significant amounts of pressure, and it had to accurately measure the time spent underwater, which the first Submariner achieved by featuring a 100 meters or 330 feet depth rating and a rotating bezel with graded aluminum inlay. It also had to be easily legible in conditions of reduced visibility, yet aesthetically pleasing. Hence the Sub's iconic luminous hour markers set against a contrasting black dial. At the 12 o'clock we can find the distinctive triangle, the quarters are baton-shaped markers, and the remaining hours are indicated with dots. Unlike popular belief, the first Submariners weren't born with the so-called Mercedes hands, but rather pencil-shaped ones. Both the chapter ring with minute or second markers as the text on the dial are gilt finished, giving the smooth surface of the glossy dial a lot of charm and depth. As for the text, it doesn't necessarily say Submariner. The ones for the UK market were signed Sub Aqua instead. Whatever you want to call it, here's where it all started. In the 60s, Rolex expanded the Submariner line with the Submariner Date 1680 and a Submariner Sea Dweller going under reference 1665. As they are merely variations of the original Submariner, they are not featured in this video. Fasten your seatbelt for the inimitable Rolex GMT Master. As civil aviation took off after World War II, airlines began to fly over longer distances. As a result, pilots required accurate watches that could display multiple time zones simultaneously. In the early 1950s, Pan American Airways, also known as Pan Am, requested Rolex to develop a watch for this very purpose. The GMT Master, where the GMT stands for Greenwich Mean Time, was introduced in 1954 under reference 6542. The watch featured a red 24-hour hand with a small triangle at the tip alongside the regular 12-hour Mercedes handset. In combination with a bidirectional 24-hour bezel, this GMT hand could be used to read the home time, whilst, for example, the 12-hour hand displayed the local time. The watch bears the nickname Pepsi as the bezel has quite a similar color scheme, so the blue and the red. 6 p.m. to 6 a.m. is in blue, and from 6 a.m. to 6 p.m. it's deep red. Notable, the inlay was executed in bakelite, an early type of plastic. Both this material used, as well as luminous numerals inside the bezel inlay, are unique aspects from Rolex we won't see on any other tool watch. Mainly because it was rather impractical, since bakelite is a tad fragile, and the radioactive luminous material inside the bezel could leak and cause illness. Funny to mention, well, I guess it's less funny for Rolex, but because of this reason, the brand actually faced a lawsuit at the end of that decade. And it might be something that is frowned upon, but the almighty Rolex did a recall on this model, so you can imagine by now it is quite a rare specimen to have in all original condition. The Milgauss is the least known of Rolex legendary tool watches. It's quite an elusive model indeed. I'll tell you about it. After the Genevan powerhouse released a dedicated diver watch, the Submariner, a field watch, the Explorer, and a pilot watch, which of course was a GMT Master in the first half of the 1950s, it now turned its attention to the needs of engineers and scientists. These men and women often worked in environments with intense magnetic fields. Think about power plants, hospitals, laboratories. Anyhow, strong magnetic fields have an adverse effect on the accuracy of watches. So this meant that the people that worked in such environments and those places either had to accept a malfunctioning watch or forego wearing one in the first place. But you guessed it, Rolex solved this problem. They introduced the Milgauss. The name of the watch was derived from the French word mille, if I'm pronouncing it correctly. It means 1000, and Gauss, which is the scientific unit for magnetism. Tests by the European Centre for Nuclear Research, also known as CERN, in the late 1950s showed that the Milgauss was indeed able to withstand strong magnetic fields, and I have to say this is quite an amazing technical achievement, and this was accomplished by Rolex for incorporating a Faraday cage to protect the movement inside the 38mm measuring oyster case. Now let's have a look at the dial. The dial is created with woven steel, creating a beautiful waffle-like surface and contributing to the anti-magneticity. Most believe Rolex first released the 6543 in the mid-50s and slightly later the 6541, but let's focus on the last mentioned as it exudes its purpose best. Most recognizable is the Lightning second hand, obviously referring to the field of expertise it was meant for. The rotated bezel is graded from 1 to 6. It's not going to be so exciting. It has no specific reason other than dividing a minute in 6 different divisions of 10 seconds. I can't make it more exciting than that, I'm afraid. I wondered for quite some time. However, there are also examples known with a smooth bezel instead. Possibly these were created for the USA market. The references 6541 and 6543 were only produced for a handful of years, and due to their specific specialized nature, around 200 were produced and sold before this line was discontinued as a whole. The introduction of the 1019 meant no more 6541 as we know it. Although it looks way different than the predecessor, the 1019 was also not really popular, but the 6541 and 6543 are indeed exceedingly rare. Zoom! Racing on to the Daytona. Rolex started making chronographs in the 1930s, but it was only until 1963 that a named product line was introduced, the Cosmograph. In some early advertisements, Rolex referred to the watch as the Le Mans. Side note, it was named after the famous racetrack in France, although this name never appeared on the dial. And after a few years, the line was officially renamed Cosmograph Daytona, the racetrack in Florida. And it's something I want to tell you. It's not really about the Daytona, but I think it is because naming it after an American racetrack has the same reason Rolex changed their depth rating from meters first to feet first, mainly to capture the USA market, I guess. So America first. The most noticeable difference between these Cosmograph Daytona models and earlier Rolex chronographs was the tachymeter scale, which is used to measure distance and speed. It moved from the traditional placement, which was on the dial, over to the bezel. And talking about the dial, furthermore, the dial itself was updated with the introduction of contrasting subdials. A few exceptions here and there. You might think about the Albino, which was previously owned by Eric Clapton, for example. But we're going to talk about the watch in my hand right now, and that is the first reference, 6239. 37mm measuring watch with a steel bezel, engraved tachymeter scale on the outside. Unlike all other watches in this list, the lug width was 19mm rather than 20mm, and another unique aspect was the manual winding movement instead of automatic. All the other tool watches in this list are automatic. And this one doesn't even feature its own movement. Inside is a Valjoux based chronograph that can be operated with the pump pushers at the 2 o'clock position, the 4 o'clock position. The second hand in the subdial is at 9 o'clock. The other subdials, as well as the central hand with triangle at the top, are used to count the time of the chronograph function. It's hard to imagine now, but Daytonas received little love after their release. Most Daytonas languished in dealer displays for years. Nowadays, Daytonas are among the most sought after Rolex models, possibly fetching the most craziest of prices, which is totally different and in a big contrast with the $210 list price when it was first released. This list doesn't include GMT Master 2, as it's very similar to the GMT Master, but the Explorer earlier in this list is totally unlike the 1655. A new chapter of the storied history of the Rolex Explorer opened with the release of the Explorer 2 in 1971. Another sturdy steel tool watch, but with a 40mm measuring case. It was bigger and way more outspoken in its design features. While its smaller brother sat on the wrist of mountaineers, the Explorer 2 was designed for the men and women that ventured into the deepest caves and across the far poles. On those areas it might be difficult to distinguish day and night in these places, and you might lose track of time, but no worries, Rolex got your back. The watch features an extra hour hand and a fixed 24-hour bezel in stainless steel so that you can always see if it's daytime or instead nighttime. This reference is best known by its nickname Fraccione, which means arrow in Italian, and it's named after its characteristic orange-shaped 24-hour hand. The hour and minute hand also have quite an uncommon and peculiar design, not to say weird, but regarding the second hand, only the first examples had a so-called straight hand. For me, the most interesting part is definitely the dial. It's so unusual. It might be true to its era, but it's unlike Rolex, I would say. This matte dial has a lot of going on at the minute track. I'm not just talking about the rectangular tritium plots for hour markers, but also the ones located in between. Well, production of the funkiest tool watch ceased in mid-80s as it went on to take a more traditional design with the 16550. Last but not least, we are not forgetting the Yachtmaster, so raise your sails for the 16628. Quite a leap from 1971 to 1992, more than 2 decades after the introduction of the Rolex Explorer 2, but now they introduced a nautical watch named the Yachtmaster. However, unlike the Submariner, the Yachtmaster was not really that much of a diving tool, more a sophisticated piece of equipment for boating. More specifically, it was made for yachting, so it had to have a luxurious look, making this watch the first professional model to be introduced solely in 18-karat yellow gold instead of steel. The way of finishing clearly reveals it was more for the refined gentleman instead of someone who isn't afraid to get his hands dirty. The oyster bracelet has polished center links, and unlike any other model from that era, not only the side of the 40mm measuring case, but the lugs are polished too. The solid bezel has a brush finish in subtle contrast to the polished numerals, and when it was first released it sported a bright white dial with something we haven't seen before nor ever saw again in any other model than the gold or bicolor Yachtmasters, large black hour markers. It goes without saying that this black paint inside the gold hour marker surrounding isn't luminous, but since the Mercedes handset is, Rolex applied a small dose of tritium in a triangular shape on the dial itself. So this is another unique aspect of this cool piece. As the plot thickens, Rolex added 2 more lines to their tool watch collection in the new millennium. Maybe my next of kin in 50 years or so will tell you about the Yachtmaster 2 and the Skyweather. Regardless, tool watches from the last century will remain to play a significant role in today's collector's world. Their design withstood the ravages of time and they are exceptionally robust, so we can enjoy them for many decades to come. Thank you for watching. I tried to make this video as uncluttered and comprehensible as possible, but there's just so many information out there about this big mystery called Rolex. However, they tend to upload historically incorrect information themselves, so even now you might know more than Rolex. Thank you once again for watching. Make sure you subscribe to our video, and maybe in the next video we will go even more in depth.